And in the past 3 years, we have several distinguished speakers, including Professor Howard Goldberg, Professor David Pollard, Professor Stephen West, and Dr. Brian Holton. And today we are very pleased and honored to have another distinguished speaker, Dr. Sylvia Lin, Renditions. Dr. Lin taught at the University of Notre Dame before he decided to become a full-time translator. He taught modern contemporary Chinese literature, and she has produced a lot of translations and also co-translated many works of Professor Howard Goldberg. Today her talk, the title of the talk is Approximated Perfection, What Jane Austen Can Teach Us About Translation. I'm sure we all will have a lot to learn from the talk. So without much ado, may I invite Dr. Lin?
Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you all for coming on a Friday afternoon. I know the semester is over, and you have I'm sure it's a long semester, and the weather is so nice, so I really appreciate you coming here. So I hope after my talk we will have a chance to have a more informal discussion. I have some examples, and so I hope we can do that. But now, let me start. And this is the first time I am reading a paper using reading glasses. So if I somewhat look stunned or didn't know where I was, please forgive me because I'm trying to find the best distance. Today's talk has a longer title, and here it goes. Approximated Perfection, What Jane Austen Could Teach Us About Translating Contemporary Chinese Fiction for American Commercial Presses. I didn't use it, obviously, because there wouldn't be enough space on the poster. But now let me use the longer title to contextualize what I want to say. But before I begin, I must make it clear to everyone here that I am not a Jane Austen scholar, and I'm not going to analyze any of her works today. I wish to speak only about contemporary fiction written in Chinese because that's what I translate most of the time. In addition, I will focus on commercial presses in the US. Western European publishers in France or Italy have literary tastes and sensibilities that are often quite different from those of their American counterparts. As I don't have much experience dealing with them, I would therefore not venture out of my comfort zone. As in most countries, there are two main publishing venues for translated works in the US, university and commercial presses. In general, commercial presses have three advantages. The first has to do with production process. University presses usually take much longer from the moment a manuscript is submitted to the day the book is published. Those of you who have books published by a university press in the US are familiar with the procedure. A manuscript must go through peer review, which usually takes at least 2 months and often longer. When the publisher finally gets the reports, the translator or translators are apprised of the reviews and makes necessary changes with responses. Sometimes the revised manuscript goes out again for another round of review before it is presented to the University Presses Board and/or faculty committee for approval. Once it is approved, it goes through the editing process. At a commercial house, the decision is made by the publisher or the acquisition editor, often very quickly, likely taking 6 months less than it would with a university press. The peer review process at a university press causes unnecessary delays, partly because the reviewers, instead of focusing on the merits of the book, tend to stray into editorial comments, such as suggestions to replace one word with another. These would all have to be dealt with in the response, which slows down the process. With commercial presses, it is understood that an editor would take care of word choices and other stylistic issues later during the editing process after the manuscript is accepted. A related topic is the role of editors. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Genius. No? Okay. If you have seen it, you will get a sense of the important role Maxwell Perkins played in the success of writers such as Thomas Wolfe, Fitzgerald, and Hemingway. A superb editor can maximize the potential and minimize the flaws of a work, but one may not be available at a university press whose focus is on scholarship, research, and convincing arguments, not creative writing. Marketing is the second reason why a commercial house may be better suited for translated works. The target readership of a university press is academics and libraries. If they do any advertising at all, it is usually on the press's website or professional organization. Translation of Chinese literature are usually promoted by the Association for Asian Studies, or online listservs like Modern Chinese Literature and Culture from the Ohio State University. And if that weren't enough to reduce potential readership, these books are often not available at bookstores. A reader has to know what he or she is looking for. Occasionally, a work of translated fiction from a university press is lucky enough to get a review in major media such as the New York Times or the Washington Post, which would help broaden the potential readership. Cost is the third reason why university presses cannot compete with commercial publishers. With a small print run, books from university presses tend to be more expensive, hence less affordable to the average reader. In the good old days, university presses had a substantial subsidy from the university system, but now most of them are required to survive on their own, constituting another reason why they have to print hardbacks and sell to libraries first. Some of their books never come out in paperbacks at all. That said, I must stress that this is not a rap on university presses. In fact, they are often the best hope for important but not commercially viable works of translation. And for translators and writers, a university press has the unbeatable advantage of a long shelf life. I've yet to hear of a university press pulping their books because of low sales figures. Now that I have dealt with the part of the long title, let me turn to Jane Austen. I imagine some of you are intrigued by the reference. There have been debates as to which character in the novel Pride and Prejudice the two title words refer to. Does Pride refer to Miss Bennet and Prejudice to Mr. Darcy, or vice versa? Some have argued that in fact, Miss Bennet and Mr. Darcy both have too much pride and are similarly prejudiced. It doesn't matter much for my purpose today, for I'm more interested in the Chinese translation of the title. What piqued my interest one day when I was looking at this Sorry. Okay. I'm a Mac user. Next page. Just this one? Yeah. Okay. This is the mug. Okay, here's the close-up. was interested in the rendering of the English title, 傲慢. Have you wondered about, have any of you read the novel in Chinese, English translation of both? Has anyone wondered why it's called 傲慢与偏见? 偏见 is easy, but 傲慢. Okay. Here's what I found in a dictionary, okay, about pride. Okay. So we have inordinate self-esteem, conceit, a reasonable or justifiable self-respect, delight or relation arising from some act, positions or relationships such as parental pride, and 傲慢, arrogant, put on airs, and rude. If you compare these definitions, okay, I would say 傲慢 is inadequate rendition of pride in what Jane Austen portrays in the novel. Certainly, we can argue that Mr. Darcy is arrogant in the way he views and interacts with Miss Bennet and her family. It takes an arrogant, conceited man to stop his best friend from courting a woman he deems unworthy of his friend's status. But it's impossible to find a Chinese word to encompass all the meanings of pride that would still sound good for the title of a novel. Hence, we have to make do with 傲慢. Another example I'd like to share is a little bit more personal. The title of Margaret Mitchell's novel, Gone with the Wind, is rendered as 飘 in Chinese. When I was in high school, my best friend and I both read the novel. One day, the theme of the novel came up in our many idle chats during the interminable wait for the result of the college entrance exam. She thought it was about Scarlett O'Hara because, as the title clearly points to Scarlett drifting in life, 飘, especially from one man to another. I said it was about a sense of wistfulness at the end of an era because I knew the English title and it implied it was taken away by the wind. She was then able to bolster her claim by referring to the Chinese title for the movie 乱世佳人, a beauty in troubled times, literally. It was about Scarlett O'Hara all along, in her view. I lost that argument. Or do I? My friend and I approached Gone with the Wind with our individual expectations and even came away with different understanding of the novel, but I think we derived similar amount of pleasure reading and talking about it. Yet, I cannot help but wonder how such a title affects a reader's experience of interpretation. Take novelist Hong Ying's 饥饿的女儿, for example. The publisher's editor of the English version did not like Daughter of Hunger and feared that it might scare away potential readers of English. I didn't realize until that day that American readers had such a limited capacity for deprivation. In any case, the autobiographical novel was eventually published as Daughter of the River, a more lyrical title that could invoke an idyllic picture. Anyone who reads the book, however, will be immediately disabused of the impression. Allow me to give you another example. Liu Zhengyun's 我不是潘金莲, which Howard and I co-translated. I heard there was a controversy regarding the movie, which I haven't seen. In the novel, to fight against the slander against her, the female protagonist Li Xuelian says, 我不是潘金莲, I am not Pan Jinlian. In Chinese, it sounds catchy as a title, but it cannot work in English. The average American reader won't know who Pan Jinlian is or why they may be interested in reading the novel. Eventually, the English title we settled on was I Did Not Kill My Husband. I take full responsibility for coming up with that title. Here's my rationale. In the water margin, Pan Jinlian murders her husband in order to be with her lover, Xi Menqing. The author, Liu Zhengyun, whose English is quite good, suggested something like, "I am not a slut." No American publisher would go for the title if they thought Daughter of Hunger would frighten off potential readers. You may know that the movie is called "I Am Not Madame Bovary." Is it a good title? I don't know. Invoking a bored French bourgeois housewife and her love affair seems too detached from the image of a Chinese woman from the countryside seeking justice. But it is an intriguing title. Later, we learned that a reader left a comment on Amazon complaining that she had expected a murder mystery when she bought "I Did Not Kill My Husband." Yet, she also indicated that she did enjoy reading the novel, which seems to prove that titles do serve to draw readers in. There are other examples, but I won't talk about them now. Sometimes cross-cultural references do have unintended consequences. Recently, a scholar from Texas wrote Howard about his translation of Mo Yan's novel, Frog, with particular interest in the religious overtone. One of the examples she cites was Xili, baptism. Here is what she wrote. Staring at a billboard containing pictures of all the babies born that year at the local hospital, an image that echoes Gugu shrines full of clay dolls, Tadpole experienced a dramatic epiphany. He is overwhelmed by the most solemn feeling a human can know, the love of life. His conversion narrative is couched in religious terms. It was as if my soul had received a solemn baptism. This seems the most obviously Christian of the passages, especially the word baptism, which is religiously specific, end of quote. In my Chinese English dictionary, Xili is defined as 1, baptism, 2, a severe test. Except in religious setting, Xili in Chinese always refers to the second definition, and it would never occur to most Chinese readers to even consider the possibility that Mo Yan was writing about a real religious act of baptism. And yet, to a highly educated, well-published scholar in America, the possibility exists. I don't know whether she would have continued reading Mo Yan with the misconception if she hasn't written Howard for clarification. What interests me more is what happens with cultural interactions when translation is involved. Baptism was first translated into Chinese as Xili, likely by missionaries, for religious rites, but the term was later used almost exclusively in a secular context. In other words, the religious connotation essentially disappeared. When it is translated back into English as baptism, it is hard for someone with a Christian background not to consider the religious implication. This example helps illustrate several questions regarding a translator's responsibilities. How far should a translator go to avoid unintended cultural references, even when they are precisely what appear in the original text? And, as we have talked about elsewhere, how much research should a translator undertake in order to be correct, either in terms of cultural or historical background? I recall once, before the internet, trying to ascertain whether a geology department was formed at a particular American university. It turned out that the author got it wrong. What should a translator do in such a case? Should he or she consider it an alternative fact, or should it be corrected? When it is corrected in the translation, will the translator then be responsible to his or her readers, but not to the original text and its author? Now that I have dealt with the macro aspect of translating Chinese, I'd like to spend some time on the micro side with some example to illustrate the complexity involved. When the topic of translating from the Chinese comes up, People point to differences between Chinese and English, such as sentence structures, grammar, the lack of tenses and number, and so on. But these are minor when compared with stylistic characteristics of Chinese writing that make for a bad translation if no adjustment is made. One of the characteristics is repetition. Generally speaking, Chinese writing allows for more repetition and in fact sometimes even encourages it. Here are two examples that we encounter when translating 毕飞宇's推拿. Okay. 都弘对男人们很失望，对女人们也一样很失望. Okay. So literal translation from the original would be, Du Hong was disappointed in men, and she was similarly disappointed in women. Editors of the English translation will likely say this is a bad sentence because of the repetition. Now here are two possible renditions to avoid the repetition. Okay. Du Hong was disappointed in men and women alike. Or Du Hong was inordinately disappointed in people, both men and women. Somehow B reads rather bland. Okay, the second one reads bland. The third one, by adding the adverb, introduces a tone that does not exist in the original. Okay. My second example, also from 毕飞宇's推拿. 沙富明出来了，他不想出来。沙富明 came up, he didn't want to come out. This is a very faithful translation, but it's not only repetitive, but also very clunky. Okay, so next one. Sha Fumin came out even though he didn't feel like it. Or Sha Fumin came up with reluctance. These two examples may seem trivial to some of you, but stylistic decisions put in the context of this particular novel could be misleading to the English readers if the repetition isn't dealt with carefully. The novel is about a group of blind massage therapists in Nanjing. I suspect the author is using repetition to create and enhance the perception that the blind live in a different world from the sighted, even though they have the same aspirations, desires, and frustrations. But the repetition could give the English reader the impression that these blind massage therapists sound somehow simple-minded or even dim-witted. Another important feature in Chinese writing that is challenging to translate is the incorporation of idiomatic expression. Again, an example from 推拿. 羊肉不杀还能叫羊肉吗？不杀还值得挂羊头卖狗肉吗？ There are several issues that make this a particularly difficult sentence to translate. First, the implied logic connecting the two phrases. Real mutton must be gamey. If it's not gamey, then it's not mutton. That's clear enough. But the author has added the idiomatic expression 挂羊头卖狗肉, and the focus now shifts from gamey mutton to the head of a sheep. Now we have to deal with the second phrase and connect the mutton to a sharp palming of dog meat as mutton. Then of course a translator had to decide what to do with the expression that is literally, you can't call it mutton if it's not gamey. If it's not gamey, then it doesn't deserve to be sold at a place selling dog meat as mutton with a sheep's head hung up to deceive the customers. Okay, this is the full meaning, the complete meaning. Then if you want to convey to the reader, then you have to do it. And imagine if you read a novel with this. If you're an English reader, you don't know the Chinese, you may find it really funny. And perhaps that's what the author intended. Okay. But as a translator, personally, my approach to translation, this would be a terrible, terrible treatment of the original, because the original is so much shorter. And I think people have different views on translation. Some focus more on fidelity to the original. But if you, particularly in translating poetry, if you have one line, 5 characters, and the translator give it 2 lines, 20 words, then I think that's a serious problem with the translation. And so I kind of like this, but that just won't go in the translation. Okay. Related to translation of idioms is the issue of cliché. Should one cliché in Chinese be rendered as another cliché in English? We all know this one. 一朝被蛇咬，10年怕草绳. There's I think a pretty good equivalent in English. Once bitten, twice shy. Or to be closer to the original, once bitten by a snake, you will be afraid of a rope for 10 years. And then another example, 船到桥头自然直. The boat will right itself when it gets to the bridge, or we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Some may say that the second one, the English idiom, is perfect since it managed to retain the reference to a bridge. Others may prefer the first one, a more literal translation, because it is more vivid and furthermore teaches the English reader about Chinese culture. Idioms like these are difficult to translate, not simply because they need to be rendered in a comparably idiomatic way, but also because they require careful consideration to avoid any unintended impression that Chinese is exotic or plain weird. Which brings up an important task and another challenge for translators. A translator of Chinese is invariably confronted with the decision of how the translated text in English should sound. There are roughly 3 levels. 1, complete domestication, so that the translation reads just as if it were written originally in English. 2, maintain all the Chinese flavors to make it sound as foreign as possible. And 3, somewhere in between, with a translation retaining a certain degree of Chineseness without sacrificing readability. For those of you who are familiar with translation theory, you know these are issues brought up by scholars and discussed by translators all the time. It is, in a word, nothing new. But what makes it worth talking about again and again is the drastic difference between Chinese and English. When one translates from Spanish or French into English, the shared tradition in culture and religion makes it so much easier to translate an idea or an image from one language to another. With Chinese into English, the task gets much more difficult. For instance, how does one render 缘分 or 老实 into English? In addition to successfully conveying concepts such as these to the English readers, a translator must also be careful not to exoticize the Chinese language or culture. In my view, translation, like all forms of cross-cultural representation, is a paradoxical endeavor. A text's uniqueness should be maintained, but its singular characters must not be so exceptional that the text or the culture becomes a caricature of itself, turning into a staple for theme parks where visitors relied on a few stereotypes to tell one culture from another. It is an understatement that many challenges face a translator every day when he or she sits down to make a work available to readers of another language. In fact, there are too many to list them all here. I will mention just one more, and this one comes mostly from readers of the original text who happen to also know the translated language, in our case, English. I will call it an obsession with the original text intended by the author. Many readers seem to live with the illusion that there is only one text, be it a novel or a poem, concerned that a translated text does not fully convey or actually loses what the author has in mind, since translation, particularly from Chinese to English, requires varying degree of interpretation on the part of the translator. I can't tell you how much I hate the movie Lost in Translation. What if the translator gets it wrong and what the readers have is not what the author meant? To be sure, translators can make mistakes, but those mistakes can be easily corrected if a translator is willing to have his or her translation read by someone else, especially a native speaker of Chinese. What these readers are referring to with their concerns are not mistakes at this level. It is something else that they find difficult to articulate, except to ask, how do you know you got it right? In fact, the same readers would readily agree that they can have varying reaction to a novel like Gone with the Wind or Beethoven's Symphony No. 9. As indicated in the main title of my lecture, translation is approximated perfection. Translators can only do their best. Ao Man may not be the most fitting rendition of Pride and Austen's title, but it has a nice ring to it and sounds better than saying 自尊与偏见. Over the past decade, there has been a growing anxiety in China over its international status, including literature. We constantly hear sloganeer-like declarations such as 中国文学走出去, as if Chinese literature were a living entity with feet that can cross boundaries. But the reality is more a case of 中国文学走不出去, at least in America. Why? There are many reasons, some having to do with translation, some with writers, and some with American readers. Now, I have to resort to generalization, as I can't and won't talk about a specific writer for obvious reasons. The first one, Chinese novels tend to be too long. Over 500,000 Chinese characters is not uncommon. When translated into English, a novel of that length can easily be over 500 pages. More than once we have been told by publishers that a particular novel is too long to either attract a broader readership or merit the financial investment or both. There seems to be a misconception, especially among the older generation of Chinese novelists, that only long novels can prove a writer's true worth. Two, a tendency toward cultural gazetteering can be an impediment to English readers' reception. China's vast territory and long history have produced colorful, unique subcultures in areas such as Shanghai, Inner Mongolia, Sichuan, or Moyan, Shandong, Gaomi. Writers are eager to share their local history by weaving the geographical location and background into their works. But when translated into English, these details can be a formidable barrier that prevents the readers from appreciating their novels. Third is a long-standing, unshakable handicap in English readers' approach to Chinese literature. Most, it seems to me, continue to read Chinese literature, particularly fiction, to learn about China and Chinese society, while they seldom read Ernest Hemingway to learn about American culture, Alice Munro for Canada, or Garcia Marquez for Colombia. I don't think we have yet reached the point where English readers buy a novel translated from Chinese because it is a good novel, not because it will teach them something about China. To reach that point, the purpose must be about reading, even though the English readers may indeed learn a thing or two during the reading process. The fourth reason is twofold and purely speculative on my part. Readers are fickle, to be sure, and it's hard to predict which novel, translated or not, will be popular among readers. But we often detect something very much like a cyclical rotation in the reception of translated works, and it appears to us that China is out and Korea is in. Chinese fiction in translation has enjoyed a fairly long period of popularity among book reviewers in the US, starting with works by Mo Yan, Su Tong, Yu Hua, and others in the 1980s. Over the past few years, we are seeing less and less mention of Chinese fiction in the New York Times Book Review, the New York Review of Books, or the New Yorker. The reviews tend to be brief when they are reviewed at all. In contrast, Korean writers seem to be taking over. Hong Kong's The Vegetarian received rave reviews, and here are a few. Han's glorious treatments of agency, personal choice, submission, and subversion find form in the parable. This is from the New York Times. A short novel of sexuality and madness that deserved its great success, from my favorite English novelist, Ian McEwan. Provocative, shocking, The Washington Post. Compelling, a seamless union of the visceral and the surreal, LA Review of Books. And furthermore, it was named one of the best books of the year by the New York Times Book Review, Publishers Weekly, BuzzFeed, Entertainment Weekly, Time, The Wall Street Journal, Bustle, Elle, The Economist, Slate, The Huffington Post, the St. Louis Dispatch, and on and on. Why all the praise, and why don't we see anything like this for Chinese writers and their work? As I said, it may be cyclical. The reviewers are moving on to another country. But perhaps something else is also at work here, a phenomenon that I borrow from industrial design, Maya. The Maya principle is an acronym for most advanced yet acceptable, coined by Raymond Loewy, famous for many long-lasting designs, such as the Coca-Cola logo. Nowadays, the Maya principle is often employed to explain why certain innovations catch on while others die out. By modifying it to mean most alien yet accessible, we may be able to understand why some translated works do well among English readers who may find novels from Asian countries alien. For them to appreciate these alien writings, something has to remain familiar, accessible to them. Again, The Vegetarian, set in Korea, it focuses on a female protagonist who has decided to become a vegetarian after a persistent, vivid dream of the bloody slaughter of animals. At some point, her family intervenes. Vegetarian diet, animal rights, and psychodrama are all familiar subject matter to American readers, which helps minimize the possible sense that Korean is an alien society and culture. It makes for a perfect draw. Under such circumstances, how do we promote Chinese fiction in the West, or at least in the English-speaking world? Should Chinese writers, translators, and publishers work in concert to reach out to readers in English? If so, how? Should a writer write for both domestic and foreign readers if he or she hopes to have works translated? Or we can always reject the idea and keep literature in an exalted position as an object of inviolable artistic creation. Some would say yes, but I need to be convinced that a writer will write not to get published, but just for the sake of writing. As for reaching out to another group of readers in English, sometimes a writer or a translator is confronted with a suggestion and request from an editor to make changes. The editorial change can be rearrangement, usually the beginning of a novel, to attract a potential reader. Or it can be the deletion of repetitive or extraneous passages to tighten the story. In our experience, not every Chinese writer takes these suggestions and requests positively. While I understand their reluctance and their sense of the sanctity of the original, sometimes I wonder why they refuse to make their text more accessible to English readers, especially in light of the fact that these readers tend to find Chinese novels and culture alien. Now, finally, the polemic. I will return to Jane Austen by quoting a passage I found online. Many critics take the novel's title as a starting point when analyzing the major theme of Pride and Prejudice. However, Robert Fox cautions against reading too much into the title because commercial factors may have played a role in its selection. After the success of Sense and Sensibility, nothing would have seemed more natural than to bring out another novel of the same author using again the formula of antithesis and alliteration for the title. It should be pointed out that the quality of the title are not exclusively assigned to one or the other of the protagonists. Both Elizabeth and Darcy display pride and prejudice. End of quote. Robert Fox argues that it's not pride but vanity for Elizabeth. But as I said at the beginning of my talk, I'm not an Austen scholar, nor do I intend to analyze her works. What I found intriguing in this quote is the reference to the success of Austen's earlier novel and the possibility that she repeated the formula, hoping for a similar result for Pride and Prejudice. Is literature a commodity? Based on Fox's comment, we can almost certainly say, yes, it is. Austen had to make a living writing and publishing fiction, and commercial success could not have been far from the mind. It is not a disparaging characterization that diminishes the value of her work. In fact, it may even attest to her talent for writing a novel that was and still is well received by her readers. And this is what we can learn from Jane Austen. Thank you.